So this is the woman who once called herself my wife. Daniel Carter's voice carried easily across the ballroom, smooth and confident, the kind of voice that expected attention and always received it. And for a moment the soft music from the string quartet seemed to fade beneath the quiet ripple of curiosity moving through the crowd. Emily Carter paused just inside the entrance of the Grand Hotel ballroom, the marble floor gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers, the scent of expensive perfume and champagne drifting through the air, and she could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her even before she fully lifted her gaze. 3 years had passed since the divorce. 3 years since she had walked out of Daniel's life with a single suitcase and a silence that most people mistook for weakness. Yet somehow the room felt exactly the same as it had during the final months of their marriage, full of polished smiles and conversations that sounded warm but felt cold underneath. Daniel stood near the center of the room beside his fiancée, a tall blonde woman in a silver dress who looked perfectly at home among the city's wealthiest donors and executives. And when Daniel raised his glass slightly toward Emily, the gesture was polite enough to fool anyone who didn't know him well. "Emily," he said with a small laugh, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I'm actually impressed you came." A few people chuckled softly, unsure whether the moment was meant to be humorous or uncomfortable, and Emily felt the familiar pressure in her chest that used to appear whenever Daniel turned a room into his stage. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, printed on thick ivory cardstock, announcing a celebration for Carter Technology's latest expansion and personally inviting her to attend, and anyone else might have assumed it was a gesture of maturity or closure. Emily had known better the moment she saw his name at the bottom. Daniel loved an audience too much to miss an opportunity like this. She stepped farther into the ballroom, her heels tapping lightly against the marble as she approached the gathering circle, her navy dress simple compared to the glittering gowns around her, but elegant in a quiet way that matched the calm expression on her face. "You look surprised," Daniel continued, smiling at the guests around him as though he were sharing a private joke with friends. Most people would avoid a party hosted by their ex-husband. Laughter moved through the group a little louder this time. Emily heard it clearly, every soft burst of amusement echoing against the high ceiling. Yet her posture remained steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. She had imagined this moment many times during the drive to the hotel, imagined the way Daniel would try to control the narrative, the way he would remind everyone that he had moved forward while she had supposedly faded into the background. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the invitation had not been a trap for her. It had been an opportunity. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her as though waiting for some emotional reaction he could use to continue the show. "You know," he said lightly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "people always ask me how I managed to rebuild everything after that marriage. It's quite a story." More smiles appeared around him, polite and entertained. Emily met his eyes calmly, the corners of her lips lifting just enough to suggest patience rather than embarrassment. The room thought this was Daniel's night, his celebration, his carefully crafted victory. And for now, she was willing to let them believe that. Daniel Carter always enjoyed the moment just before people laughed because it gave him a brief second to admire the attention gathering around him like light around a chandelier. And tonight was no different as he lifted his glass slightly higher and continued speaking with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the entire evening belonged to him. "You see," he said smoothly, turning slightly so more guests could hear him, "starting a company from nothing is difficult enough, but rebuilding one after a complicated marriage is even harder." A few sympathetic murmurs moved through the small circle around him, and his fiancée, Caroline Whitmore, gave his arm a gentle squeeze that looked supportive but carefully measured. Emily noticed the way Caroline studied her for a moment, curiosity mixed with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed she had inherited the better version of the same life. Daniel continued as if telling an inspiring business story at a conference. "When Emily and I were married, things were not exactly stable," he said with a casual shrug, as though discussing a minor inconvenience rather than the collapse of a marriage. But sometimes failure teaches you exactly what you need to succeed. The word failure hung in the air just long enough for several people to exchange glances before someone laughed softly and others followed, the polite laughter of people who wanted to remain on the winning side of a conversation. Emily stood quietly while the sound faded, her gaze drifting briefly across the ballroom. The space was enormous, easily 200 feet across, filled with round tables dressed in white linen and tall arrangements of white orchids. Waiters moved carefully between guests carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne, while a large screen near the stage displayed the Carter Technologies logo glowing in blue light. It was a perfect celebration of Daniel's success, carefully designed to show investors and donors that his company was stronger than ever. Daniel looked back at Emily again, the faint smile returning to his lips. Of course, he added lightly, we all grow up eventually. Some people just take longer than others. Caroline laughed softly beside him, and several guests followed again, their attention fixed on Emily now, as if waiting to see whether she would respond or quietly retreat. For a moment, the only sound was the distant music of the quartet, playing near the balcony, and the soft clinking of glasses from another corner of the room. Emily could feel the weight of their expectations pressing gently around her, but her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. She remembered another night in this same hotel years earlier when Daniel had first celebrated landing his largest investor and how he had squeezed her hand proudly then, introducing her as the woman who believed in him before anyone else did. The memory passed like a shadow across her mind and disappeared just as quickly. Entrance had just opened again, and a few new guests were stepping inside beneath the golden light of the chandeliers. Among them was a man most people in the room had never met in person, but many would recognize if they looked closely enough. A tall figure in a dark suit walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who did not need an introduction to command attention. And although Daniel had not noticed him, yet Emily saw him clearly as he paused near the entrance, and his gaze settled quietly across the room until it found her. The man near the entrance did not rush, and he did not try to draw attention to himself. Yet something about the quiet certainty in the way he moved made several people nearby glance in his direction as he crossed the marble floor beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Emily noticed him immediately, and although her expression remained calm, a subtle shift passed through her posture as if a silent signal had just been received. Daniel was still speaking, enjoying the small circle of guests around him who listened with polite fascination as he continued describing the rise of Carter Technologies. In business, Daniel said confidently, lifting his glass again, the most important thing you learn is who truly adds value to your life and who does not. Caroline smiled beside him, and someone nearby nodded as if the comment carried wisdom worth remembering. Emily allowed herself a small breath as she listened, her attention drifting once more toward the tall figure moving slowly through the crowd. The man paused briefly near a group of investors who recognized him with sudden surprise, their quiet conversation stopping mid-sentence as they watched him continue forward. His dark suit was simple but impeccably tailored, and his presence carried the kind of calm authority that could silence a room without a single raised voice. Emily remembered the first time she had seen him months earlier in a quiet office overlooking the Hudson River, where the windows stretched nearly from floor to ceiling and the late afternoon sun had turned the water into a sheet of gold. He had listened more than he spoke that day, and when he finally extended his hand, his words had been careful and direct. Now that same steady confidence followed him across the ballroom as he moved closer to the gathering. Around Daniel was in the middle of another story when one of the guests suddenly glanced past him and straightened slightly. Others began to notice the approaching figure as well, and the tone of the conversation softened as curiosity spread quietly through the group. Daniel finally turned halfway to see what had captured their attention, and for the briefest moment his confident smile hesitated. The man stopped just a few feet away, close enough that the light from the chandelier above reflected faintly across his watch and the polished marble beneath his shoes. Emily met his eyes across the small space between them, and the faintest hint of recognition appeared there before he looked calmly at Daniel. No introduction had been offered yet, but the room had grown noticeably quieter, as if the air itself was waiting. Daniel cleared his throat lightly, trying to recover the comfortable control he had held only seconds earlier. "Can I help you?" he asked with a polite but cautious tone. The man studied him for a moment, and then his attention returned briefly to Emily before he spoke in a voice that was calm, even, and impossible to ignore. "I believe I arrived at the right time," he said. Several guests exchanged curious glances as the tension in the small circle shifted in a way that no one could quite explain. Emily remained still, yet her calm seemed different now. No longer the quiet patience of someone enduring a moment, but the steady composure of someone who had been waiting for it to arrive. The man stepped slightly closer, and as the distance between them disappeared, his hand reached gently toward hers, not in a dramatic gesture, but in a natural movement that felt as though it had been planned long before this evening began. And when his fingers closed around her hand, the simple action carried a quiet certainty that made several people around them fall completely silent. For a moment, no one in the small circle spoke because the gesture was so simple, yet so unexpected that it disrupted the quiet rhythm of the evening more effectively than any loud argument could have done. The man held Emily's hand with calm confidence as though the action required no explanation at all, and the warmth of his grip was steady, reassuring, and completely natural. Emily did not pull away. Instead, she turned slightly toward him, and a faint smile appeared on her lips, the kind of expression that carried both recognition and quiet gratitude. Daniel Carter blinked once as he watched the scene unfold only a few feet away from him, his mind racing through the familiar list of investors, competitors, and executives he knew across the technology industry. Something about the man's face stirred a distant memory, but he could not place it quickly enough. Caroline Whitmore glanced between them with open curiosity before leaning slightly toward Daniel and whispering under her breath, "Do you know him?" Daniel did not answer immediately because the confidence he had displayed moments earlier was now struggling against a rising uncertainty. Around them, several guests were already exchanging quiet murmurs as they studied the newcomer more carefully. One older investor near the back of the group adjusted his glasses and whispered something to the woman beside him, and her eyes widened slightly in response. Emily felt the subtle shift in the room as recognition began to spread through a few corners of the crowd, but she remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, and her gaze steady. The man beside her finally looked directly at Daniel again and offered a small polite nod that carried neither hostility nor apology. "Good evening," he said calmly. His voice was low but clear enough that those closest to them could hear every word. Daniel forced a polite smile to return to his face even though the tension in his jaw was becoming visible. "Good evening," he replied cautiously. "I am afraid I did not catch your name." The man paused for just a moment as though the question had been expected all along. "Nathaniel Wolfe," he said simply. The name moved through the group like a quiet spark. Two guests immediately turned their heads toward one another in surprise, and another man, near the champagne table, inhaled sharply before trying to hide his reaction. Nathaniel Wolfe was not the type of person who attended events like this without attracting attention. His reputation across the financial world had grown quickly over the past decade, and the companies connected to his investment firm were discussed constantly in business journals and financial news broadcasts. Daniel's smile stiffened slightly as the name settled into his thoughts. He had heard it many times before, but never imagined he would encounter the man in the middle of his own celebration. Nathaniel's attention returned briefly to Emily, and there was a quiet understanding in the way they looked at each other. Daniel noticed it immediately, and a faint crease appeared between his eyebrows. "And how exactly do you know my ex-wife?" Daniel asked with a tone that attempted to sound casual, but could not quite hide the edge of suspicion beneath it. Nathaniel did not release Emily's hand as he answered. Instead, he glanced around the circle of guests as if acknowledging the silent audience before speaking again. "We have been working together for some time," he said calmly. The words were simple, yet the effect was immediate. A ripple of curiosity moved through the group, and several people leaned closer as though they had just realized the evening might become far more interesting than anyone expected. Emily finally spoke again, her voice gentle but steady. "Daniel," she said quietly, "it seems you have been telling everyone your version of the story tonight." Daniel held her gaze, uncertain now whether the conversation was still under his control. Emily's faint smile returned, calm and patient, as the soft music continued playing somewhere across the enormous ballroom, and the attention of the entire circle settled fully upon her and the man standing beside her. The quiet that followed Emily's words did not feel empty, but heavy with attention, as if every person in the circle had suddenly realized that the evening was shifting in a direction no one had predicted. Daniel Carter kept his polite smile in place, but the tightness in his shoulders betrayed the effort it required. Across the ballroom, the soft music of the string quartet continued drifting through the air, yet around them the conversation had faded into a curious hush. Nathaniel Wolfe still held Emily's hand with calm certainty, and his presence beside her seemed to create a quiet balance that Daniel could not easily interrupt. Daniel finally let out a small laugh that sounded lighter than he felt. Working together, he repeated as if the idea amused him. That is interesting. I did not realize Emily had entered the investment world. Several guests glanced at Emily again with renewed curiosity. To many of them, she had always been known simply as Daniel Carter's former wife, the quiet woman who disappeared from the public circle after the divorce. Daniel tilted his head slightly as he studied her expression. Last time we spoke, he added with casual confidence, you were still figuring out what direction your life was going. The remark produced a few restrained smiles from people who assumed the comment was harmless, but Emily simply listened without reacting. The chandeliers above reflected gently across the polished floor, while waiters passed in the distance, carrying silver trays filled with glasses of sparkling water and champagne. Emily looked at Daniel calmly, the same patience still visible in her eyes. People change, she said quietly. Sometimes more than others expect. Nathaniel glanced toward her briefly with a subtle nod, as if he understood exactly what she meant. One of the investors standing near Daniel cleared his throat softly and spoke with open curiosity. Nathaniel Wolfe? The man asked. As in Wolfe Capital? Nathaniel turned his attention toward him and gave a polite nod. The recognition moved quickly through the group. Several guests straightened their posture, while others whispered quietly to one another. Carter Technologies had grown rapidly in recent years, but Wolfe Capital operated on an entirely different level of influence across the financial world. Daniel noticed the reactions, and his expression grew more guarded. That is quite a powerful connection, Daniel said carefully, glancing between Nathaniel and Emily. But I am still trying to understand how the two of you met. Emily finally shifted her gaze across the room for a moment before returning it to Daniel. The calm in her voice remained unchanged. Do you remember the winter after our divorce? She asked. Daniel frowned slightly as he searched his memory. Of course, he replied. That was when the company almost collapsed before we secured the emergency funding. Several guests nodded because the story of Carter Technologies surviving that difficult quarter had become a well-known chapter in Daniel's public narrative of success. Emily watched him quietly for a moment longer before speaking again. Yes, she said softly. That was the winter everything changed. Nathaniel's grip on her hand remained steady and the faintest hint of a smile appeared on his face, as though he already knew what she was about to reveal. Around them the small circle of guests leaned slightly closer, sensing that the real story behind Daniel's greatest business victory might be far more complicated than the version they had heard all these years. Daniel Carter did not immediately respond to Emily's words because the memory she mentioned carried a very different meaning for him than it did for her. The winter after their divorce had been the most dangerous moment in the history of Carter Technologies. Revenue had fallen sharply, investors had begun to question the company's future, and for several tense weeks Daniel had believed the entire business might collapse. Yet somehow an anonymous investment fund had stepped in at the last possible moment, injecting enough capital to stabilize the company and restore confidence across the market. Daniel had told that story many times at conferences and interviews, always describing it as a miracle of timing and persistence. Standing in the ballroom now, surrounded by curious faces, he forced another confident smile, as if nothing about the past surprised him. Yes, Daniel said slowly. That was a difficult season, but the company survived. That is what matters. Emily watched him quietly, her expression calm but thoughtful, as though she were observing a version of history that had never fully belonged to him. Around them the guests remained attentive, the earlier laughter completely gone now. Nathaniel Wolfe stood beside Emily with the same composed presence, his gaze drifting briefly across the room, where more people had begun to notice the unusual stillness forming around the group. Daniel crossed his arms lightly, trying to regain the authority that had slipped from his voice moments earlier. I assume you remember that period because the divorce had just been finalized, he added with a measured tone. It was a difficult time for everyone. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Yes, she said softly. It was difficult, but not for the reasons most people believed. The remark created another ripple of curiosity among the listeners. Caroline Whitmore glanced from Emily to Daniel again, her polite smile fading slightly as the conversation moved further away from the comfortable narrative she had expected to hear tonight. One of the investors standing near Daniel spoke quietly, unable to contain his interest. If I remember correctly, the man said, the company received a major investment from a private fund that winter. No one ever discovered who the investor was. Daniel nodded once. That is correct, he replied. Some investors prefer to remain anonymous. Emily's gaze met Nathaniel's for a brief moment before she returned her attention to Daniel. The silence between them felt different now. No longer tense, but deliberate, as though a hidden piece of the past was slowly approaching the surface. Daniel, Emily said gently, do you remember the night you called every investor you knew and none of them answered? Daniel's smile faded slightly. The memory was too specific to dismiss easily. It had been a freezing January evening and the temperature outside had dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit while he sat alone in his office staring at a list of numbers that refused to work. I remember the situation, Daniel said carefully. Emily nodded once. That night you said something to me before I left the apartment for the last time, she continued. You told me that without the company you would lose everything. The guests listened in silence as her calm voice carried across the small circle. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I was under pressure, he said defensively. Anyone in my position would have been. Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice quiet but clear. Pressure can reveal many things about a person. The remark was not hostile, yet it carried a quiet weight that caused several guests to glance toward him again. Emily took a slow breath and looked around the room, noticing how many people were now listening. When her eyes returned to Daniel, there was a gentle steadiness in them that made the moment feel almost inevitable. The investor who saved your company that winter, she said softly, was not a stranger. The words settled into the air like a quiet weight that no one in the circle could ignore. Daniel Carter stared at Emily for a moment, unsure whether he had heard her correctly, while several of the guests exchanged uncertain glances as if trying to understand where the conversation was leading. The investor who saved your company that winter was not a stranger. Emily's voice had not risen and she had not moved from her place beside Nathaniel Wolfe, yet something about the calm certainty in her tone made the sentence impossible to dismiss. Daniel forced a small laugh, though it sounded thinner than before. Emily, he said slowly, the fund that invested in Carter Technologies was registered through 3 different holding companies. Even my legal team never discovered who was behind it. Emily nodded gently as though she had expected that response. Around them the soft music continued drifting across the ballroom, while more guests began to notice that an unusual conversation was unfolding near the center of the room. A few people from nearby tables leaned subtly closer, pretending to adjust their glasses or reach for drinks while listening carefully. Nathaniel Wolfe remained quiet, his expression calm as he observed the exchange. Emily finally spoke again, her voice still measured and steady. That is true, she said. The investment moved through several companies before it reached Carter Technologies. Daniel spread his hands slightly, as if proving his point. Exactly, he replied. Which means none of us ever knew the investor. Emily's faint smile returned. You did not, she corrected softly. The quiet emphasis in her words caused Daniel's brow to tighten. Caroline Whitmore glanced between them again, her curiosity now clearly mixed with concern. What are you trying to say? Daniel asked, the confidence in his voice slipping just enough for those closest to notice. Emily turned her gaze briefly toward the large screen near the stage where the Carter Technologies logo glowed against a deep blue background. For years Daniel had stood proudly beneath that symbol during interviews and conferences, always describing how determination and strategy had carried the company through its most difficult moment. Emily remembered watching those interviews in silence, never correcting the story. Until tonight. She looked back at him calmly. The winter after our divorce, she said gently, you believed every door had closed. Daniel's expression hardened slightly as the memory returned. Yes, he replied. That was obvious. Emily continued with quiet patience. What you did not know was that someone was still willing to open one One of the investors listening nearby spoke almost under his breath. You mean the anonymous fund? Emily nodded once. Nathaniel finally glanced toward the man and then back to Emily with a subtle look of encouragement. The attention of the entire circle had now settled fully on her. Daniel folded his arms again, attempting to restore his composure. If you know who that investor was, he said carefully, then I would certainly be interested in hearing it. Emily studied his face for a moment, the same face that had once shared her home, her plans, and her belief in a future they would build together. Her voice remained gentle when she answered. Daniel, she said quietly, you spent years telling people that. Investor saved your company. He nodded impatiently. Yes. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around Nathaniel's hand as she delivered the truth he had never imagined. That investor, she said calmly, was me. Silence spread through the small circle so completely that even the distant music seemed to pause for a heartbeat as the guests tried to absorb what they had just heard. For several long seconds no one spoke. The silence that followed Emily's words was deeper than any conversation that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. Daniel Carter stared at her as if the sentence had arrived in a language he did not recognize. Around them, the small circle of guests stood completely still, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief as the meaning slowly settled in. The investor who saved Carter Technologies was standing right in front of them. Daniel blinked once, then shook his head with a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That is not possible, he said quickly. Emily, the amount that fund invested was over $20 million. His voice carried a careful confidence, as though the size of the number alone could dismantle the idea she had just presented. Emily did not react to the challenge. Instead, she simply watched him with the same steady patience she had carried all evening. Nathaniel Wolfe remained beside her, his posture relaxed, his hand still gently holding hers. One of the older investors in the circle finally spoke, unable to contain the tension building in the room. $20 million, the man repeated quietly. That is correct. I remember the report from that quarter. Several others nodded. The number had been widely discussed at the time because it had arrived when the company was only weeks away from losing critical contracts. Daniel turned slightly toward the man as if grateful for the confirmation. Exactly, he said, which is why Emily's statement does not make sense. Emily tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words with calm interest. It makes sense if you know where the investment came from, she replied gently. Daniel frowned. And where exactly would that be? He asked. Emily glanced briefly toward Nathaniel before answering. From a private holding company that Nathaniel helped structure. The name caused another ripple to pass through the guests. Several people looked toward Nathaniel with renewed attention as the connection began to form in their minds. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. You are telling me that the fund came from him? He asked. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice calm and even. Not exactly, he said. My firm managed the legal structure. The capital itself belonged to Emily. The quiet certainty in his tone removed any trace of doubt from the statement. A soft murmur moved through the group as the reality of the explanation settled into place. Daniel looked from Nathaniel back to Emily, searching her face for any sign that this was some elaborate misunderstanding. You did not have that kind of money, he said carefully. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Not before the divorce, she replied. The answer was so direct that several guests leaned closer to hear what would come next. Emily continued in the same calm voice. Do you remember the software design contract I developed during the final year of our marriage? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he tried to recall. The project had seemed small compared to the scale of Carter Technologies at the time, and he had rarely asked about it. Emily saw the uncertainty in his expression and gave a quiet nod. That project became the foundation for a licensing deal with 3 technology firms in California, she explained. The agreement was finalized 2 months after our divorce. One of the investors inhaled sharply as the implication became clear. Emily looked back at Daniel gently. The royalties from that contract created the capital that funded the investment in your company. The words settled across the circle like a quiet revelation. Daniel stood frozen for a moment as the story he had told the world for years slowly began to unravel in front of the very audience that had always believed it. Daniel Carter felt the room turning against him in a way he had never experienced before. Only minutes earlier the guests around him had been listening to his stories with admiration, laughing politely at his remarks, and celebrating the success of Carter Technologies as if it were a symbol of his personal brilliance. Now those same faces carried a different expression, one shaped by curiosity, confusion, and the quiet realization that the foundation of his story might not belong entirely to him. The soft light from the chandeliers reflected across the marble floor, while the distant music of the quartet continued playing, yet inside the circle. Surrounding Emily, the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel studied her face again, searching for any sign of exaggeration or performance, but Emily's calm remained unchanged. Nathaniel Wolfe stood beside her with the same composed stillness, his presence now understood by nearly everyone listening. One of the younger investors spoke first, his voice careful but direct. "If the royalties from that licensing deal created the capital," he said slowly, "then the anonymous fund that stabilized Carter Technologies technically came from Emily's work." Several heads turned toward him in agreement as the implications settled deeper into the room. Daniel shifted slightly, the confidence he had carried all evening now replaced by a quiet tension in his posture. "That project was developed while we were married," he said quickly, "which means it was part of our shared life at the time." Emily listened without interrupting. Her expression was not angry, and it was not triumphant. It was simply patient. "The idea began during our marriage," she acknowledged gently. "But the companies who licensed the software only agreed to the contract after I completed the final architecture alone." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but paused when several guests leaned closer, clearly more interested in her explanation than in his defense. Emily continued calmly. "After the divorce, the agreement allowed me to receive the full royalty rights because the final design was registered under my name." Nathaniel glanced toward the listeners briefly as though confirming that the explanation was both simple and accurate. One of the executives standing near the back whispered quietly to another guest, the realization spreading through their conversation like a quiet ripple. Daniel noticed it immediately, and the realization unsettled him more than Emily's words had. For years he had spoken about the anonymous investor as if that mysterious figure had simply recognized his potential. He had never imagined that the source of that capital might be standing quietly across the table from him. "You never told anyone about this," Daniel said finally, his voice lower now. Emily gave a small nod. "There was no reason to," she replied. "The investment protected the company during its most fragile moment. That was enough." The sincerity in her tone made the explanation even harder to challenge. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances as they absorbed the significance of what they had just learned. Carter Technologies had not only survived because of an unknown investor, it had survived because of the very person Daniel had just spent the evening belittling. Emily looked around the room briefly, noticing the shift in the atmosphere. When her eyes returned to Daniel, they were calm and steady. "You once told me the company was your life," she said quietly. "And in that moment, I believed saving it was the right thing to do." Nathaniel's hand remained gently around hers as the silence returned once more. Daniel could not immediately answer because the narrative he had repeated for years had just been replaced by a truth he had never considered, and the audience that once applauded him was now looking at Emily Carter with an entirely different kind of respect. The silence that followed Emily's final words did not feel temporary. It lingered in the air like a quiet shift in gravity, pulling the attention of every nearby guest toward her. Daniel Carter stood motionless for a moment, the confident energy he had carried at the beginning of the evening now replaced by something far more uncertain. Across the ballroom, conversations had begun again, but the small circle surrounding them remained focused entirely on the woman who had just revealed the hidden truth behind the company's survival. Emily did not raise her voice or seek attention. She simply stood beside Nathaniel Wolfe with the same calm presence she had carried from the moment she walked into the room. Daniel finally cleared his throat, forcing a thin smile that looked more practiced than natural. "If what you are saying is true," he said carefully, "then I suppose I should thank you." The sentence sounded polite, yet it carried the uncomfortable tone of someone realizing that the audience around him had begun to see the story from a different angle. Emily regarded him quietly before answering. "You do not need to thank me," she replied. "At that time I believed the company deserved another chance." Several of the investors nearby exchanged thoughtful glances. One of them, an older man with silver hair who had followed Carter Technologies for years, spoke slowly. If Emily provided the capital through that structure, he said, then technically she became a significant early investor in the company. The remark caused a ripple of murmurs through the group. Daniel noticed the shift immediately, and his posture stiffened again. That fund was structured through a private entity, he said quickly. It was never connected publicly to any individual. Nathaniel Wolfe answered before Emily could respond. That is correct, he said calmly. The holding structure protected Emily's identity during the early growth phase. His tone was steady, as though the explanation required no further defense. Another guest spoke quietly, which means Emily still holds the original investment position. Nathaniel gave a small nod. The realization spread through the group with unmistakable clarity. Carter Technologies had not only been saved by Emily's investment. She had remained connected to the company all these years through that original position. Daniel's expression tightened again as he processed the implication. The shares were never publicly transferred, he said slowly. Nathaniel looked at him with calm composure. No, he confirmed. They were not. Emily glanced briefly toward the large screen near the stage where the Carter Technologies logo still glowed proudly under the chandeliers. When she looked back at Daniel, her expression remained gentle, but there was a quiet strength in her voice now. You built the company into something successful, she said sincerely. No one is denying that. The acknowledgement surprised several of the listeners because it carried no bitterness. Emily continued calmly. But the foundation of that recovery began with the investment that winter. Daniel looked around at the faces surrounding them, and for the first time that evening he realized that the attention of the room had shifted away from him entirely. The story that had once celebrated his resilience had quietly revealed another chapter he had never told. Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice measured and calm. Tonight was meant to celebrate growth, he said. And sometimes growth includes understanding the full history behind success. Emily did not add anything further. She simply stood quietly beside him while the guests around them absorbed the truth that had slowly unfolded. The chandeliers continued shining across the marble floor, and the soft music drifted through the ballroom. Yet the atmosphere of the celebration had changed in a subtle but permanent way. The story of Carter Technologies was no longer the story Daniel had told alone. It now belonged equally to the woman who had once believed in it enough to save it when no one else would. Daniel Carter had built his reputation on control. For years he had been the one guiding conversations, shaping narratives, standing at the center of rooms exactly like this one while investors and partners listened to every word he spoke. But now the control had slipped away in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. The guests surrounding him no longer looked at him with the same unquestioned admiration. Their attention had shifted, drawn quietly toward Emily Carter, the woman who had stood silently through his earlier remarks and revealed a truth none of them had expected. Daniel straightened his posture as if determined to recover some part of the authority he had lost. If that investment truly belongs to you, he said carefully, then it was still just one moment in the company's history. His voice was calm again, though the effort behind it was visible. Carter Technologies grew because of the work that came after. Emily listened without interruption. She understood what he was trying to do. Daniel was returning to the story that had always worked for him, the narrative of determination and leadership that had built his reputation. She did not argue with it. Instead, she nodded gently. You are right, she said. The company grew because of the work you and your team did afterward. Several people in the circle seemed surprised by her agreement. There was no challenge in her voice, no attempt to compete for credit. Nathaniel Wolfe watched the exchange quietly, the calm expression on his face suggesting that he already understood the direction the conversation was moving. Daniel relaxed slightly, encouraged by Emily's acknowledgement. Then I think we can agree that the past has already served its purpose, he said, lifting his glass again with a small confident gesture. Tonight is about the future. A few polite smiles returned among the guests, but the atmosphere remained thoughtful rather than celebratory. Emily noticed the shift as well. She turned her gaze briefly toward the stage at the far end of the ballroom, where a small podium had been prepared for the evening's presentations. The Carter Technologies logo still glowed behind it, bright and confident beneath the chandeliers. When she looked back at Daniel, her expression remained calm. The future is exactly why I came tonight, she said. The sentence caused several guests to glance at one another again. Daniel lowered his glass slowly. What do you mean? He asked. Emily paused for a moment before answering, as though choosing her words with care. When the investment was created, she explained gently. The agreement included a clause that allowed the original investor to review the company's position after 10 years. One of the executives nearby spoke immediately, recognizing the implication. That is a standard strategic clause, he said quietly. Nathaniel gave a small nod of confirmation. Emily continued in the same steady voice. That review period begins this year. The meaning of her statement moved through the group like a quiet current. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. And what exactly does that review involve? He asked. Emily did not hesitate. It allows the investor to decide whether to maintain the position or restructure it. The room grew still again as the weight of her words settled across the listeners. Carter Technologies had always believed the anonymous investor would remain invisible. Now the person holding that position was standing in the middle of the celebration itself. Emily's tone remained calm as she added one final detail. Nathaniel and I came tonight because the review process begins tomorrow morning. The chandeliers continued shining across the ballroom while the guests absorbed the significance of what she had just revealed. The future Daniel had been celebrating only minutes earlier was suddenly connected to a decision that no one in the room had expected Emily Carter to hold. The words Emily had spoken seemed to settle slowly across the ballroom, like the final note of a song lingering in the air long after the musicians had stopped playing. The review process begins tomorrow morning. No one in the small circle moved for several seconds because the meaning of that sentence carried more weight than anyone had expected when they arrived at the celebration. Daniel Carter lowered his glass completely now, placing it on the nearest table as though he needed both hands free to process what he had just heard. Around him the guests remained attentive, some quietly whispering to one another, while others simply watched Emily Carter with a level of respect that had not been present earlier in the evening. Daniel finally spoke, his voice controlled but noticeably quieter than before. You are saying that the future of Carter Technologies depends on your decision. Emily did not rush her answer. She looked briefly toward the glowing company logo behind the stage, the symbol Daniel had proudly built into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the region. When she looked back at him, her voice was steady and calm. The review allows the investor to evaluate the next direction of the company, she said gently. That is all. Nathaniel Wolfe remained beside her, his presence calm and composed as always. Yet now the connection between them was clearly understood by everyone listening. The anonymous investment that had once seemed like a miracle had never been random. It had been a choice made quietly by the woman standing in front of them. One of the senior executives who had worked with Daniel for years spoke carefully. If the investor restructures the position, he said, that could influence the entire strategic direction of the company. Nathaniel gave a small nod in acknowledgement. Daniel glanced around at the faces surrounding him and realized that the conversation had shifted entirely into territory he had not prepared for tonight. What had begun as a celebration was now quietly becoming a moment of truth about the company's foundation and its future. He looked back at Emily again, his voice softer this time. Why tell everyone now? He asked. Emily's answer came without hesitation. Because tonight you invited me here, she said simply. The honesty of the response caused a few quiet smiles to appear among the guests. Emily continued in the same gentle tone. You wanted to show the room how far the company had come since the past. Daniel held her gaze, understanding the meaning behind her words more clearly now. Emily was not attacking him. She was simply allowing the complete story to exist in the same room where he had once told only part of it. The chandeliers continued shining above them while the music drifted softly across the marble floor. Emily took a slow breath and spoke again, her voice calm but sincere. Daniel, when I invested in the company I did it because I believed the work you were building deserved to survive. Several guests nodded quietly as they listened. Emily looked around the circle briefly before returning her attention to him. And tonight I came for the same reason. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the tension that had filled his face earlier. What do you mean? He asked. Emily's faint smile returned, calm and composed. The review tomorrow is not about ending the investment, she said gently. It is about deciding how the next chapter of the company should grow. The guests listened carefully as she added one final sentence. And the truth is, Daniel, the company is strong enough now that the decision is no longer about saving it. Her voice remained soft but steady as she finished the thought. It is about who deserves to shape what it becomes next. The final moments of the conversation did not explode into drama the way many people in the ballroom might have expected. Instead, the atmosphere settled into something quieter, almost reflective, as though everyone present understood they were witnessing the closing of a long chapter that had begun years earlier. Daniel Carter stood facing Emily, the bright glow of the chandeliers reflecting softly across the marble floor between them. The confident host who had welcomed guests at the beginning of the evening was no longer performing for the room. Now he was simply a man realizing that the story he had carried for so long had another voice within it. Around them, the guests remained respectfully silent, sensing that the conversation had reached a moment that did not belong to interruption. Emily Carter stood calmly beside Nathaniel Wolfe, her posture relaxed, her expression composed in the same quiet way it had been from the moment she first stepped into the ballroom. She did not appear triumphant. She did not look angry. The only thing visible in her eyes was clarity. Daniel finally spoke again, though the sharp confidence from earlier in the evening had softened into something more thoughtful. So tomorrow you decide the future of the company, he said slowly. Emily shook her head gently. No, she replied. Tomorrow we discuss it. Nathaniel gave a small nod beside her, confirming the meaning of her words. Emily continued in the same steady voice. Carter Technologies is not the same fragile company it was 10 years ago. It has a talented team, strong partnerships, and real momentum. She paused briefly before adding the final piece. The purpose of the review is not to take control of the company. It is to decide how the next stage should grow. Daniel listened carefully, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as the meaning of her words became clearer. For the first time that evening, he seemed to see her not as the woman who had once been part of his past, but as someone who had built a path entirely separate from his own. One of the investors standing nearby spoke quietly. Then the future of the company may include both of you shaping it together. Nathaniel allowed himself a faint smile at the suggestion, but did not answer. Emily looked briefly at Daniel, the expression on her face calm and sincere. The truth is, she said softly, I did not come tonight to prove anything. Her voice carried easily through the stillness of the circle. You invited me here to show everyone how far the company has come. She gestured lightly toward the glowing logo near the stage. And you were right about that. It has grown into something impressive. Daniel followed her gaze toward the stage, the blue light reflecting across the room that had once echoed with his earlier confidence. When he looked back at her, there was a quiet understanding in his expression now, the kind that only appears when someone finally sees a story from its complete perspective. Emily's faint smile returned. But success, she continued gently, is rarely built by only one person. The guests listened as the final meaning of the evening settled into place. Emily had not returned for revenge, and she had not needed to raise her voice to reclaim respect. Her strength had been in the truth she carried quietly all along. Nathaniel's hand remained steady in hers as the music from the quartet drifted through the ballroom once more. Emily looked at Daniel one last time, her voice calm and almost peaceful as she finished the thought that had begun the moment she stepped into the room. The difference is, she said softly, some people spend years trying to be recognized, while others simply become impossible to overlook. And as the conversation faded into the soft glow of the chandeliers and the quiet murmur of the returning celebration, the room understood something Daniel Carter had only just begun to realize. Emily Carter had never come back to seek revenge. She had simply come back as the truth.